My name's Sean Pokorney. I'm from the Duke Clinical Research Institute and Duke University, and I'm really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the IMPACT-Afib implementation of stroke prevention atrial fibrillation randomized trial. The We know that atrial fibrillation increases the risk of stroke by fivefold. Therefore, patients with risk factors for stroke have a class 1 guideline indication for anticoagulation for stroke prevention. We have extremely effective medications to prevent stroke in this patient population. There have been meta-analyses that have shown that warfarin relative to placebo reduces the risk of stroke by 64%. The NOACs reduce the risk of stroke by 19% relative to warfarin. The challenge is that anticoagulation is underused for stroke prevention, with only 50 to 60% of patients with guideline indications receiving the treatment. So the underuse of anticoagulation is a major public health issue, and this was really the target of the IMPACT-Afib trial. And so the trial was designed as an 80,000 patient randomized trial of patients with atrial fibrillation, and patients were randomized to a patient and provider mailing, a single patient provider mailing, versus a control population that did not receive a patient and provider mailing prior to the primary endpoint assessment. So all patients had to have atrial fibrillation to be included. They needed to have a CHA2DS2-VASc score of 2 or greater, with no bleeding in the last 6 months, and they had to have not filled an anticoagulant prescription in the prior 12 months. And the aim of this trial was really to make patients an agent of change, to increase the use of oral anticoagulation among patients with atrial fibrillation and risk of stroke. And so the primary endpoint was to determine the difference in the proportion of patients with atrial fibrillation who initiated an anticoagulant over the 12-month trial period. The trial was very unique in that we partnered with with insurance companies in the United States, and worked with insurance companies through a public-private partnership between the FDA and these insurance companies called the Catalyst Framework. And the insurance companies we're partnered with were Aetna, Healthogen, as well as HealthCore, Humana, Harvard Pilgrim, and Optum. And these insurance companies actually use claims data within their own data to identify patients who would qualify for the study. And then ultimately, the insurance companies sent out the mailing education intervention to the patients and to their providers. All follow-up was done with claims-based data follow-up, again, within those insurance companies. And aggregate level data was sent back from each of the data partners or insurance companies to Harvard, and Harvard masked those results and sent them to Duke Clinical Research Institute, where a meta-analysis was performed. And so the IMPACT-Afib work group was comprised of representatives from each of the data partners, as well as Harvard, Duke Clinical Research Institute, Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, a patient representative, and the US FDA. And all of the education intervention materials were developed by that work group and refined with work from qualitative interviews with patients and providers. And so we have data so far from 4 of the 5 data partners. We'll have the data from the 5th data partner that'll be included in the final manuscript. But within the 4 out of 5 data partners, we found that we had over 47,000 patients that were randomized with a mean follow-up of about 425 days. And so the patients had mean age of 78 years. They were about 50% of them were female. It was a very high-risk patient population, both for stroke and bleeding, with a mean CHA2DS2-VASc score of 4.5, and 47% of patients having a high Atria score of 5 or greater. And both groups of randomized patients were really equivalent in all of their baseline characteristics. So the primary outcome was, again, an initiation of an anticoagulant over the follow-up period, and there was no statistically significant difference between the early intervention and control arms, with both arms having a 10% initiation rate at 1 year. And there were numerically more initiations of an anticoagulant in the early intervention arm, early after the intervention took place, and that difference was attenuated over time. So in conclusion, it was among a population with a guideline indication for an oral anticoagulant for stroke prevention with atrial fibrillation, there was no statistically significant difference in the rates of oral anticoagulant initiation at 1 year with a single education mailing. The rates of oral anticoagulant initiation were low, with only 1 in 10 patients initiating an anticoagulant. We showed that it was feasible to identify, enroll, and obtain outcomes through this very novel study design using the FDA Catalyst Network, which was, again, this distributed framework where we never had any patient-level data.